Today is the 12th of July, 2017. And the title of the show is The Outbreak of the Spanish Civil War on July 18th, 1936. And that war continued until the end of March 31st, 1939. And the title of this general series is called Athens Speakout, number 409. And when the Spanish Civil War broke out, I was only 6 years old, and I was too young to understand the beginning months of the Spanish Civil War. And I discovered the existence of Spain and suffering and pain listening to the radio. And when I first understood war, I heard on the radio the killing of Chinese by the Japanese army. And the Chinese were the good guys, and the Japanese were the bad guys. And just like the Indians were the bad guys, and the whites, cowboys, were the good guys. In those days, the cops were the good guys, and the robbers were the bad guys. And that's how most students in grammar school learn about war. There are good guys and bad guys in war. And I heard on the news in Orlando, Florida, when I lived with my Uncle Rob, and he was listening to the news, and I was then only a kid, and my grandfather, Dan Whealey, was the brother of my Uncle Rob, who was actually my great uncle, and he was the most successful of the Whealey family. And he had in his room a big globe, and the globe showed the maps of all of the pilots who went around the world. It had Lindbergh's flight. It had a famous pilot then known as Willie Post, the first pilot to fly around the globe. And I looked at that globe, and then he had a collection of National Geographic magazines. And there were more pictures in the National Geographic than there were in the Life magazine. And when he died, he gave me the globe, and I used to have it in Athens, Ohio. I don't know where it is today. We'll have to check in the antique room for that. Anyway, it showed the beginning of the Sino-Japanese War, and I could see the map of China, and I could visualize China on the globe. So in May of 1938, I was 8 years old, and I began a collection of war cards. The war cards were more popular than baseball cards, and this card began with number 1, showed the Japanese invasion of Beijing on the 7th of July, 1937. And there were a series of 288 cards published in this set called The Horrors of War. And about 191 of these cards showed in detail combat of the Japanese and Chinese, because that was the biggest war going on in 1938. But then the publisher of the cards, beginning with card 19, started to show a series on the Spanish Civil War. And we had a little picture of General Franco and a picture of the President of the Spanish Republic.
That's shown in the cards in the middle there.
You got pictures?
Yeah, we've got the pictures which are shown on the screen, Bob.
Well, I hope the audience can see that. You'll have to point out card 5, 4, what is that?
This is the middle one on the left shows Franco.
Good.
And the middle one on the right shows President Azaña
Okay.
of the Republic of Spain.
That's correct. Good. Anything else you want to show?
Right. Well, the top shows flames. It shows a church in flames after the victory of the Popular Front in February 1936.
Yeah, that was probably card 19.
Could very well be. And then there's also a picture here which shows the funeral for Calvo Sotelo, who was a right-wing Spanish politician.
Who gave the name of the Spanish nationalists to Franco's crusade against the Spanish Republic.
He was assassinated in July, just about this time of year. I think was the funeral was on the 13th of July. And it was sort of the precipitating factor for the outbreak of the Civil War on the 17th and 18th of July, 1936. Then on the bottom, Bob, we should point out that you have two cards that show Adolf Hitler. Those were in the 1938
Yeah,
group.
at the end of the series in 286 and 288 and so forth, the publisher of these cards began to talk about the rise of Adolf Hitler and the road to Munich and the takeover of Hitler of Sudetenland. And in fact, one of these cards here is Neville Chamberlain meeting Adolf Hitler at the famous Munich conference of October 1938.
1938. That's the bottom one on the left.
Right.
The bottom one on the right shows Adolf Hitler addressing a Nazi party rally.
That was called Party Day.
Yes.
A captive parliament of Nazis who just, instead of having a parliament, just said Sieg Heil, Sieg Heil. Adolf Hitler is the Führer. Adolf Hitler is the ruler of Germany.
Right, and this is 1938, remember? This
Yes,
is
right.
during the Spanish Civil War and before the outbreak of the Second World War.
That's
that
true.
we know more about because we
right.
were in that one.
All right. So getting back to my text, when I when I started buying these cards,
And you were only 8 years old at the time.
in May of 1938, I began buying these cards, a penny and a slice of chewing gum, and later the company had 2 cards and a slice of chewing gum, all for 1 penny. And the kids on my block all rushed down every week to get the new cards. They came out every week. Anyway, at that time, in May of 38, Franco was winning the Spanish Civil War, and in May of 38, he was in the process of splitting the major cities of Spain, Barcelona and Madrid, and the cities were the strongholds of the Popular Front and the left-wing government of Manuel Azaña and the left-wing coalition was called the Popular Front, and it was a coalition of liberals, socialists, and communists. And that was a very controversial issue among the kids who bought these cards. Everybody knew the Japanese were the bad guys. Everybody knew that Mussolini was a bad guy and Hitler was a bad guy. But who are the loyalists and who are the rebels? Most of the kids that I knew were Catholics and were leaning toward the rebels, but I didn't know why. And I only met about 2 older students, Protestants, who vocalized the fact that they were sympathetic to the loyalists because I lived in a Catholic neighborhood. Most of my neighbors were Catholic kids.
Right,
and the Catholic school was a block, less than a block from my house.
All right.
Yeah, right.
And Franco was supported primarily
by
the Catholic Church, although there were an important group of Catholics in Spain. The Basques were very Catholic, but they were also left-wing in politics, and they supported the Republic.
Right. So there were about 50 of these cards concerning the Spanish Civil War from May of 38 to the last days of March 1939. And then the series had some cards on Mussolini and the Italian Ethiopian War.
That was even earlier.
They went back to 1935, and here we knew the good guys and the bad guys, because the Italians was led by Benito Mussolini, who invented the word fascism and was conquering Ethiopia, the last independent state that was headed by a black emperor called Haile Selassie. It was the oldest empire in the world, going back to the origins of Christianity in the 300s. And that was a Christian country and a black country. And the British Conservative Party under the League of Nations had a duty to protect the independence of Ethiopia from the Italian invaders. So Anthony Eden was a young conservative and was Britain's representative to the League of Nations and was defending Haile Selassie against the bad guy Benito Mussolini. And that was part of the background of how the Italian-Ethiopian War and the Spanish Civil War and the Sino-Japanese War all were three different origins of World War II.
Yes.
Because later these three powers became the Axis, and
Yes.
that went on to World War II.
Right. Italy, Japan, and Germany were the Axis powers.
Okay. So then I'm going to ask Lois a question. What was your understanding of the Spanish Civil War when you graduated from Stanford, California University, and you knew something about Spain at that time when we met in Ann Arbor, Michigan in 1951, or 52. It was 53. When was it?
54.
54. We met in January of 54. There we
January
go.
54, yes.
But you
indeed.
had graduated in 51.
Yes, yes.
All right, tell us about that.
Well, let me say that since I am 2 years younger than Bob, I really have no memories of the Spanish Civil War. I was 4 years old when it began. And actually, my first memory of something historical, it's kind of odd, but it was from 1939, at which time I would have been 7. And I remember seeing a headline in the San Francisco paper. And the headline had this, startling question. Will Hitler die in 1940? So it must have been from the year 1939. And somehow that stuck with me. But that's my earliest memory of the coming war, which, of course, we didn't enter until 1941 in December when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. But the Second World War had begun in the fall of 1939 in Europe. And some people call it a European-wide civil war because the Germans were on one side.
Yeah, that is the theme of this article, which we're going to discuss. Now, before I do that, I want to get back to exactly when we met. You had some idea of the Spanish Civil War from your Stanford education.
Yes, yes.
What did you learn at Stanford?
Well, I can't remember in particular.
But you knew something about the topic.
What I do remember is the fact that, it was about the 6th of January, and I was a graduate student in education at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. I'd been there already for, the first part of the semester before Christmas. And I went to a square dance because the previous year I'd been a teacher on an Indian reservation in northern Nevada, where our primary entertainment actually was a weekly square dance. So I was quite interested in square dancing, went to the square dance, and we had one of those mixer type things. The music stopped and you danced with the person that met you coming when the music stopped. And it happened to be a young man named Robert H. Whealey. So and that was the last dance of the evening, so he walked with me to my home on Catherine Street in Ann Arbor, and we talked about the Spanish Civil War because we were both interested in it, and I believe you were working on a paper at the time.
That's right.
On Spain.
And you knew something about it because you were very interested in the paper, and you had heard of Franco.
Yes.
And you had heard of the American International Brigades somewhere,
yes.
somehow.
Yes.
The Abraham Lincoln Brigade.
Abraham Lincoln Brigade. But
Nobody
also,
mentioned that at Stanford to you?
Oh, I'm sure they did. But let me mention, Bob, that I had a special interest in things Spanish, you might say, simply because I grew up in the West, and the West had once been part of Mexico.
Right.
Nevada and California, where I lived, had once been part of Mexico. And actually, my parents, Lois Dymel and Edgar Dymel, before I was born, had lived in Mexico for a rather lengthy period of time. They'd lived there. My mother lived there for 3 years, and my father lived there for 4 years. And they lived on the west coast of Mexico in Mazatlan. And so my mother learned quite a bit of Spanish, being the Mexican Spanish that she learned there in Mexico. And we had some items in our home that she had brought back from Mexico. So I had a special background, you might say, in things Spanish and Mexican.
Well, getting back to this paper called Communism and the Spanish Civil War, when I discovered that you knew something about it, I asked you to proofread the article, and you began to learn more about the Spanish Civil War and the communism when you proofread that article.
That's true. And we have continued on that because...
You are a better writer than I am. Let's get to the heart of it.
Well, I gave you some suggestions along the way.
Right.
I proofread your material. But you have published a book on the German intervention in Spain.
Yeah, but that took a long time.
That was a long project. However, that was basically your thesis, your MA thesis, and what you worked on your PhD.
Right.
Was actually sort of follow-up to the Spanish Civil War. And it connected with Germany because at the end of the Spanish Civil War, Hitler was very interested in getting all the money
right.
that he had coming, he thought, from Franco for
right.
providing arms and so on.
Right.
And he sent an economic specialist named Voltat to Spain in the summer of '49.
Let's get back to this article now.
Okay, to the war itself. I'm just trying to...
talking about this article by Young. Her name is Gladys Young or Gladena Young, and she teaches history at the University of Washington in Seattle. And she is writing 2 books. And this article has 2 titles. The first title is Guerrilla Violence Across the Borders. And the second one is The Russian Revolution, the Spanish Civil War, and the European Civil War. Well, this second subtitle is a big essay in intellectual history, which I'm going to concentrate on. And I hope that Lois concentrates on the guerrilla violence across the borders and the Russian war and intervention in Spain and does the second part of this article. That's my plan here.
Well,
Okay.
we work independently, so we do have different ways in which we come to the subject.
Right.
I want to mention, since we're talking especially right now about the outbreak of the war in
Okay.
July of 1936,
Right.
that there was a song, a popular song that came from the 1930s that was in my fireside book of folk songs. And that song is called Los Cuatro Generales,
The four generals.
the four generals.
And the fifth was the fifth column, a group of spies.
Well, the four generals were the rebel generals,
Franco.
including Franco. Franco became the most important one, but he was not the original conspirator. The
Okay.
most important original conspirator was General Mola. And General Mola was in the north of Spain, in Burgos area.
No, north of Burgos.
Well, in that area, north
Up.
of Madrid, certainly.
He
Near-
came from Navarre. Navarre,
Right,
a Basque
right.
province,
Right.
on the border of France.
Right, but Mola was the prime conspirator planning the uprising
That's true.
for months. As soon as the Popular Front was elected in
Right,
February,
in February the plans began.
the planning began.
And Franco didn't declare his loyalty until about June. And he decided he will join the conspiracy.
Right, it was later on.
Right.
And but Mola, interestingly enough, you mentioned the fifth column. The four generals were coming from different parts
Well,
of
I think
Spain.
you better say something about the third general, Queipo de Llano.
Queipo de Llano was from the south of Spain, from
Sevilla.
Sevilla, and that was always his stronghold. He was important.
Pronounced Seville by the British.
Yes.
But it's pronounced Sevilla in Spanish.
Yes. So
Well, they call it Seville.
and today we call it Seville, anglicizing the name entirely.
Yeah.
But that's where Queipo de Llano came from. Mola came from the north, and Franco was actually in the Canary Islands at that time,
That's correct.
because when the Popular Front won, they thought, uh-oh, we better
You're
get...
talking about February.
Yeah, I'm talking about
Well,
February.
let's get rid of this guy.
They-
He's dangerous.
Yeah, he was a very important general in Spain. Spain had a lot of generals. One reason being, I mean, let's go a little bit into the past history, okay,
Right.
Bob?
It was a great empire.
It was a great empire.
Philip II was the height of it.
Philip II in the 17th century.
And they settled Latin America.
They settled Latin America, all of it except for Brazil, which was settled by the Portuguese.
Right.
Which is why Spanish is the spoken language in most of Latin America.
Right.
But in 1898,
We had the Spanish-American War.
the Spanish-American War, which was a very brief war, and
3 months.
And at the end of the war, the U.S. wound up with what was left of Spain's empire:
Cuba.
Cuba and
Not
the
le-
Philippines.
Yeah, we took Philippines but Spain still hung on to Morocco. Spanish Morocco.
Yes, yes, but America got the
The last of the empire in the New World.
right, Cuba, and of course we were interested in the Pacific because of the Hawaiian Islands
That's
and
right.
so on, and so we got the Philippines also.
We conquered the Philippines.
Now, but the thing is, why were there so many generals after Spain had lost its overseas empire? It still had Spanish Morocco, as you point out.
It still had in 36.
Well, there
It
was
no longer has Spanish Morocco.
no, but in those days, in 1912, the French and the Spanish divided up Morocco among themselves, and France took the major part.
Well, it
of
was actually
Morocco.
1904.
Okay, well, there was a treaty in 1912 that
There was a second treaty
there
in
was
1912.
there was a treaty,
There were 2 Moroccan crises.
right? And after the second Moroccan crisis, the Spaniards had pretty firm hold on a small part of Morocco, but very strategic because it was right at the mouth of the Mediterranean.
Gibraltar was the British naval base that
Across.
kept the Spanish Empire weak.
Yeah, and it was across from Spanish Morocco.
Right, right. You got it.
So That's why there were, but they had fought for a long time in Morocco.
Trying to put down the Moroccan citizens.
Yeah, the
And they
Islamic people there.
Yeah, they're all Muslims.
They were
They're
all
Berbers.
Berbers, they were
Moroccans.
Muslim, and they fought back against the Spaniards for at least 15 years or so.
Well, they were still fighting in 1936.
Well, that was later. I mean, they really had kind of lost out by the late 20s. But in the meantime, Franco himself had fought in Morocco for
That's right.
a number of years.
For about 10, 15 years.
And generals like Mola, probably Capo Dayano too, had all this experience of fighting
Moroccans.
in Morocco
Right.
before the Spanish Civil War broke out.
Correct.
So there we are, back at 1936.
All right, I want to get back to the article, and I would like to talk about the author, Glennie Young. And she has confusion, in my opinion, about these two articles. The two articles are the guerrilla activities across the borders. That's her first article. And the second article is a huge history of ideas, which tries to link up the Russian Revolution, the Spanish Civil War, and what she calls the European Civil War. Well, she doesn't give any dates. But if you're going to talk about the European Civil War, you have to go back to 1914, because that is the beginning of World War I. And then you have to go through these Italian, Ethiopian, and Spanish civil wars, and you get to World War II. That's part of this Civil War.
Right. The
And that's a
European
big,
Civil
big,
War
big thesis, okay?
is a modern notion.
That's her notion.
Yes.
Nobody's written this book yet called the European Civil War. That book has not been written, and she proposes to write it.
That's right. But we would call it World War I and World War II.
Yeah, that's what you call it.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I'm just talking about this new scholar and what her ambition is.
Yeah.
And what I'm saying is that looking at her article, my book on Spain is very narrow in chronology and is called a monograph. And if she writes this book, I hope she puts this Hitler and Spain and the Nazi role in Spain as one of the books in her vast bibliography. And she already suggests some books that she's going to put in this bibliography. Mm-hmm. And this European Civil War then starts in 1914, and World War I goes on until 1924. And most people don't know that.
Well, that's because
Versailles was 1919.
That's
that
right.
was only good for England, France, the United States. But the Turkish Empire was still fighting in Greece until 1924. And Kemal Ataturk was a revolutionary who allied with Lenin, and they finally surrendered in the Treaty of Lausanne, 1924, and Turkey became an independent republic, modeling itself after the West and repudiating its old Ottoman history. And Turkey
Yes.
was going to be part of this European Civil War. Can't be avoided. That's what I'm trying to say. So then World War II starts out very slowly in 1931 and goes until 1945. So her bibliography has got to be huge, and that's going to be a difficult book to write. So anyway, the first book that she suggests that she's going to put in there is a book written by Hannah Arendt. Hannah Arendt is a very controversial historian, born in Germany, Jewish, came to the United States, became an American citizen, and worked on two books. The first one is the most controversial, called Eichmann in Jerusalem, which got into the Arab-Israeli wars and Hannah Arendt is controversial among Jewish historians to this day. There are some who like her, and there are some who dislike her.
But she's quite famous.
She's quite famous. And that's going to be, according to Professor Young, going to be one of her sources.
Yes.
And now the second book of Hannah Arendt is called The Origins of Totalitarianism.
Yes,
in
that's
which she
broader.
in which she brings in Nazism, communism, and imperialism.
Mm-hmm.
Now, imperialism is a very significant subject because no American in the mass media wants to admit that the United States has imperial ambitions. And that led to these recent wars. The wars in Korea, the wars in Indochina, the wars of LBJ and Nixon. And when does the Russian-Soviet Union collapse? In 1991? Is she going to bring the story of this European Civil War down to 1991? What's her end date? That's the question I have for her.
Well, maybe you'll have a chance after she writes this lengthy
Well,
book
I'm just talking about her bibliography.
to review it.
Yeah, okay. So it's, she mentions Hannah Arendt, and she mentions, now the second book she mentions, no, the second book is called Ernst Nolte. Now, he is a German, West German conservative. And his book is called The Three Faces of Fascism.
All right.
And he compares French fascism, going back to 1870, and Italian fascism and German fascism. And his book covers the period 1870 and ends in 1945.
Okay, but let's point out again, as you mentioned earlier, this whole term, fascism, actually, the word was not invented until Mussolini
Formed
organized
the Fascist Party in 1919.
the Fascist Party
Right.
in Italy. And now we have fascism with a small f,
Right.
which means sort of extreme right-wing politics,
Well,
including imperialism and often
there are lots of people
racism
who,
and
lots of
various
people are
things.
looking for the American fascists, but that's a hint, but it's not quite accurate.
Yeah, it's
I would call them the radical right.
okay.
That's the new
fine.
word for fascists in the United States, the radical right.
The radical right. Well, anyway, but it's, again, it's an interesting concept because it came from ancient Rome. Mussolini had an ambition to go back to the glories.
He wanted to be the new Roman emperor.
Yeah, he had an ambition to restore the glories of ancient Rome
Right.
when Rome ruled the Mediterranean, at
And in
least
the
the northern
1930s, he wanted to take
Mediterranean.
over the Mediterranean.
Right.
And Spain was a base. Another
Yes.
base was Egypt. And that's
Uh-huh.
why he was interested in the Suez Canal. Another base was Turkey. The Dodecanese Islands were little islands off Turkey, which had been promised at Versailles Treaty for Italians. Okay. But Italy was a weak power, and they couldn't get the Dodecanese Islands. So the Italians thought that the Americans and the British sold out the Italians at the Versailles Treaty.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons that
He changed sides. He said,
yeah,
well, next time, we're going to go with
joined
the Germans.
which it took a while because they both had designs on Austria.
Right.
And finally, Hitler just took it. He took it in 1938 and 39. In fact, he took what was left of Austria, Czechoslovakia. He took what was left of Czechoslovakia in 1939, but he'd already annexed Austria in 1938. So, well, a lot of people
Let me
were
take a look at
watching the
this.
Spanish Civil War. Hitler was making hay while the sun shines in the east, and taking over in first Austria and then Czechoslovakia.
Well, we're getting back now to this bibliography. She mentions Hannah Arendt, and she talks about Ernst Nolte, and I've described those books. Now, she mentions the next historian is a historian I never heard of, and I've never read his book, and I don't know anything about him. But she says there is a left-wing scholar by the name of Enzio Transversio. Well, I presume he...
Sounds Italian somehow.
I presume he's an Italian, but I've never looked at the book. But he does talk about violence. He does talk about the theme of this book.
Yes, let me say something brief about this, okay?
Right, go ahead.
What we have here actually is a...
2 articles.
Yes, but these are in the Volunteer, which is the Abraham Lincoln Brigade Archive newsletter.
Right.
Because there were Americans who went to Spain.
Called the Abraham Lincoln Brigade.
Abraham Lincoln Brigade. They fought for the Loyalists, for the Republicans, against Franco and the rebels, or the Nationalists, as they're sometimes called. So,
or they're sometimes called fascist.
yes. Well, they had their own fascist party called the Falange.
That's correct.
The Phalange. The Spanish Phalange was invented in the early 30s by the son of the dictator, Primo de Rivera.
That's Antonio Primo de Rivera.
Right.
Founded a Spanish fascist party.
Called the Phalange. Well, he
was Falange. Falange in Espanol.
Falange, yes. He was one of the relatively early victims of the Spanish Civil War.
Victims to the Republicans. They shot him. They said, this guy's dangerous.
That's right. They shot him. But you might say, on the other side, a famous person who was a nationalist, who was a loyalist supporter, was the poet Garcia Lorca.
He was shot by the Franco.
He was shot by the Franco. He was the famous person shot by the Franco people. Yeah.
So we have martyrs.
We have martyrs. And an important thing that Spain did was right away, see, one of the things that happened in 1937, exactly 80 years ago this spring, there was a German attack by air on the Basque village of Guernica in northern Spain. And Guernica...
That became the most famous painting in the 20th century.
Yes, Picasso made it.
Picasso was the famous artist of the 20th century.
It was in the late April of 1937 that German planes bombed Guernica.
Right.
And they bombed it with
Luftwaffe aircraft.
Luftwaffe aircraft.
And Italian aircraft.
And Italian
That's been
aircraft.
Hidden. The Italians participated.
They were also. But they hit it with incendiary bombs.
That's correct.
And the little
and percussion
village.
bombs. And percussion bombs.
The little village burned down.
Right.
So that was the end of April. Well, Picasso, who was already a famous model.
Living in exile in France.
He was a Spaniard, but he was living in exile in France. And he immediately painted this huge picture. We have it showing here on the screen.
Very famous.
Yeah, over on the...
It shows you the black and the white.
And the gray. The black, the white, and the gray.
And these symbolic figures of women dying.
And children dying in bombardment. And there's a central horse there that's...
they killed animals.
And there's a picture of a woman carrying a dead baby. And it's
the horrors of war.
This was the horrors of war. Well, this was painted immediately after April 26th, when Guernica was destroyed. Right. Picasso painted this huge painting. And I saw it many times.
I saw it in New York, and you saw it in New York.
Yes, because it was a main feature at the Museum of Modern Art up on 57th Street in Manhattan for years and years, because for one thing, Picasso said it should not go to Spain
Until it restores democracy.
until it, well, first what he said was until the republic is restored.
Okay, republic meant democracy.
Well, the thing was, Bob, that when Franco finally died in 1975, after having been the dictator in Spain for almost 40 years, they did not have a republic. They restored the monarchy, and the grandson...
But this monarchy was like the British monarchy.
Yes, it was a democratic
It was
monarchy.
a constitutional monarch.
Yes, and so what happened was that finally they said, okay, there's no republic in Spain, but there is democracy.
Right.
And so they did permit, by that time Picasso had passed on. They
And
permitted
it went to the Prado Museum in Madrid, and then later it's been moved to the Basque Country.
Is that right?
It sits in the Basque Country. The Basques want it out of the Prado.
Uh-huh. Okay.
I think it's in the town of Guernica.
Well, maybe the restored town. Yeah, that could be. We personally have never visited Guernica, but we have visited in Spain, first in Barcelona, which we first visited in 1956,
Right.
when you were in the American Army in Germany.
Correct.
And you got a 3-week pass.
Right.
To go to, we drove in little VW bug down through Switzerland and France to northern Spain, to Barcelona, where we were for a couple of days.
We went to a Republican triangle. Barcelona,
Madrid,
and then to Valencia.
to Valencia.
And then back out to Barcelona.
Barcelona and Valencia are both on the coast,
Yeah.
the Mediterranean
Right.
coast.
Right.
But we did drive through Zaragoza, which had
Very,
been...
very right wing.
Yes, that
And
had
there
been
we
a part
saw
of...
old Catholicism in action. What did we
Franco.
see in that cathedral?
Well, what I remember was that there were pilgrims. I remember a woman going up the steps of
It was
church.
black medieval costume,
Yes.
crawling up from the back of the church all the way up to the altar.
Well, I remember the one on the outside who was crawling up the stairs outside
Well,
to get into the church on her knees.
right.
Yeah,
Well, I don't know whether I saw her go the whole length of the cathedral.
right.
And then at the top of the cathedral were one incendiary bomb, about that long. And it said that the Republican Air Force had tried to bomb
Had tried to bomb that church.
Zaragoza. Now, Zaragoza is the capital of the West Point of Spain. And that's where Franco got his training, at the military academy in Zaragoza. That's where all these generals became
Well,
career generals.
They also, they certainly had a military academy in Toledo, south of Madrid, because that was one of the first goals that Franco had on his trip north with the Nationalist Army, was to go to Toledo, because the military school in Toledo, the governor
That was a
there,
fortress. That was a fortress.
it was a fortress,
And the fortress was held by Republicans because they captured,
the Republicans,
the militia captured that fortress and locked up the generals that had been in that castle.
they locked themselves up. They were hostages
go ahead.
inside.
Right.
The whole town of Toledo was under Republican control.
That's correct.
But the Alcazar,
The soldiers were locked up.
the Alcazar, the fortress.
Alcazar, the Alcazar, A-L-Z-A, Alcazar. is the-
C-A-Z-A-R.
Yeah.
And the accent is on the C-A, Alcazar. Yeah. So
Well,
anyway.
you pronounce it your way, I'll pronounce it the way the Spaniards call
Oh,
it.
well,
Madrid.
we're probably both murdering the Spanish language.
Well, I've lived in Madrid for 2 years.
Well, you've lived in Madrid, certainly, much
was called
longer than
Alcázar.
I. Much
Alcázar.
longer than I.
Now, do you know why Z is pronounced T-H?
Well,
In Mexico, they call it Alcázar.
yeah, they
pronounce
pronounce it
the
a
Z.
Z. Yeah,
But in Spain, in Madrid,
yeah.
Z is pronounced TH, Athania.
Uh-huh.
That was because King Philip II had a lisp and couldn't pronounce Z, and he said Alcatha. So that's why Madrid accent uses this peculiar accent, Alcatha.
Well, anyway, Toledo was first on Franco's list of places to seize.
Right.
But, you know, he got to the outskirts of Madrid, but he couldn't capture the city
The
itself.
four generals couldn't.
Yeah, they
Because
couldn't capture the city
Soviets,
itself.
the international brigades were backed up by Soviet advisors.
The Soviets helped, and that's what the article in the Volunteer talks about, is the Russians who had had experience in their own civil war, and a number of them went to Spain and helped the Spanish loyalists, and many of them went back to Russia and the Soviet Union, as it was in those days, and were part of the war against Germany, Nazi Germany, when the Germans invaded in 1940 into Soviet Union. Well, anyway, one Ohio connection I wish you'd mention, Bob, is getting back to the Abraham Lincoln Brigade archives. And that was, I remember you wrote an article about an Ohioan who was active in the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. In fact, he was the son of an Ohio governor.
Right.
I can't recall his name. Do you recall his name?
Well, the governor was called George White.
White. So
and his son was called David McKelvey White.
David McKelvey White.
And David McKelvey White taught English, I think, in Brooklyn University, and became much more left-wing as a young kid. And he decided to volunteer for the Abraham Lincoln Brigade.
Right, and he got back from Spain. There were a number of Americans who died in the Abraham Lincoln Brigade.
Well, when he came back, since his name was well known in the United States, the Communist Party of the United States, let's make David McKelvey White the commander of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade.
And so he was that. And Bob wrote an article about him. And
Because
in fact,
he was buried in Marietta, the home of George White.
And there were some people who were actually a little bit surprised and unpleasantly surprised.
And when I wrote that article, the head of the Ohio Academy wrote protests to my friend Tom Smith, who taught Ohio history, and said, why did you allow that radical to put that article in there?
Remembering David McKelvey White of
go ahead.
Marietta, who was a member of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade and actually headed it for a brief time at the end of after the Spanish Civil War.
And I met the man who buried him in Spain. And he took the remains of David McKelvey White from Brooklyn and had him buried in
Marietta.
And I met him doing research in London.
Okay. Well, and there was a member of the Ohio University faculty here when we first came in 1964, who was a veteran of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. He's been gone for many years now. But do you remember his name?
Schmidt.
Schmidt.
James Norman Schmidt.
James Norman Schmidt.
His last name was Schmidt, but he published his novel under the name James Norman.
James Norman.
And the novel is called The Fell of Dark.
Which is about Spain.
Well, it's about the last month.
The last month of the Civil War.
From March 1939 to March 31st. Because there was a little conspiracy about how to end the war. Why should Barcelona surrender, and when should Barcelona surrender? And there was a little revolt led by a general or a colonel, Casado, who rebelled against the Popular Front government and said, the war is over, let's surrender. And that's the story. Now, the prime minister was called Juan Negrin.
Yes,
and he wanted to keep on fighting to the last day. And Juan Negrin fled to France and lived in France all during World War II in exile.
Many of the people who had been loyalists wound up in Mexico,
Many of them went to Mexico.
and a number of
Some of them went to France.
refugees. There
And
were thousands of
the
refugees.
real communists went to the Soviet Union.
Yeah, yeah, like Dolores Ibarruri, La Pasionaria.
She was the Communist Party in exile.
Yes, and
And she lived until the Spanish monarchy was restored under Juan Carlos. She was still alive.
She became a member again of the Spanish Cortes in the late 1970s. But
Very honorary, though.
she finally passed away. She was a pretty old lady by then, as
Yeah.
one might guess. But she was very famous during the Spanish Civil War. So these are some of the things that we know about Spain and the Spanish Civil War, and we're getting ready to wind up here, Bob. Is there something?
Have we got 2 minutes left?
About 2 minutes. So say something important about the Spanish Civil War, not about this guy.
Not about this European Civil War.
No.
You think I've covered enough of that?
I think we've had enough of that. Let's say
Okay,
a little
well, if
more
you
about
say so.
Spanish Civil War.
We could mention a few other historians that should be in this bibliography.
People we know.
John Coverdale. You know
About
who
the
he is?
Italian intervention.
He wrote a book on Mussolini and the Spanish Civil
Right,
War.
Italian intervention.
And that was the first book review I ever did.
Uh-huh.
Because I met somebody at the American Historical Association. I was telling about how I was working on Hitler. So they gave me the copy of this book free of charge to do the book review.
Right.
Now, John Coverdale is a rather conservative American.
Okay, but what are some of these others?
All right. There was a guy by the name of Willard Frank. Do you know who Willard Frank is?
Yes, Willard Frank.
He wrote a PhD thesis for Kolodny. Do you know who Kolodny is? Kolodny was a volunteer for the Abraham Lincoln Brigades
Okay.
and wrote the first book on the resistance, the Battle of Madrid, when the Soviets came there.
In
that
the
book
late
was
fall
published.
of 1936.
Yeah, that book was published, got very bad reviews because the United States was fighting anti-communism then.
Yeah.
Now, after the Vietnam War, Spanish Civil War was rehabilitated.
Sort of, yeah.
The left came back.
Right. Well, and I think you should mention two historians of the Spanish Civil War that we know personally.
Who, Angel Viñas?
Angel Viñas, who is
And Paul
younger.
Preston?
Well, I was thinking more about Herbert Southworth, who wrote a long, long book on Guernica.
That's correct.
And he wrote in the book the big book of the big encyclopedia on the Spanish Civil War, he wrote the story of what happened at Guernica. Southworth, and we visited him in his castle in France.
Right.
In the 1980s, it
Right.
must have been, I guess.
And Southworth came to Athens.
He visited here in
And
the
I
1970s.
took Southworth to Ohio State and introduced Southworth, and he gave a speech to the Ohio State History Department.
Good.
And then Southworth and I met in La Jolla, in San Diego, at several conferences.
Yes, there's a collection of his words.
Right.
He had a tremendous collection of Spanish Civil War materials, which
Right.
he gave to the University of San Diego.
Right.
University of California, San Diego.
That's the best library,
right, Southworth, Herbert Southworth.
and his archives are there.
But Angel Viñas is still writing. The only problem is all his books are in Spanish. I don't think anything of his
All right,
has
we
been...
got 2 minutes.
has been,
we're summarizing
transferred.
anyway. We started summarizing before the 2 minutes.
Right, we began summarizing, mentioning these other important historians.
Okay.
And,
So you want to say something more about Viñas?
well, we know him well. We were in Spain in 1977-78. You had Fulbright time in Spain, and we met Viñas then.
Okay, well, Viñas wrote a book called July 1936.
Right.
which was something like my book on the Spanish Civil War.
Only the outbreak, going up to this outbreak of war.
He just talked about the conspiracy, how it began.
Right.
And then he wrote other books.
He's written many other books on
right.
Spain.
But now, Angel Viñas's father was a socialist and a Republican.
Mm-hmm.
And he was born in 1939. But he had all of his education under the Franco regime.
Right.
But he was a brilliant scholar.
Yeah, he went to Germany.
He went to Germany, right,
Yeah.
as a
Post-World War II Germany.
And he began to look in the German archives.
He got all this good information.
And he saw
wonderful fellow.
that the Germans and the Americans and the British had an entirely different understanding of the Spanish Civil War. So then he knew German fluently and French fluently and English fluently, and he then discovered European scholarship and American scholarship, and so I eventually met Viñas in Spain, and then I reviewed his books.
Yes,
for the American Historical Review.
Right. But unfortunately, as I say, none of them have been translated into English. They're available in Spain. Well, I think it's time to end this session, Bob.
Well, I will summarize with the conclusion. This show is part of a long discussion and debate, and I always end these shows, Athens Speakout, that debate is the oxygen of democracy.
Right.
And the origins of World War I and World War II and the Spanish Civil War and this European Civil War is very debatable. And I think that Gladys Young is going to be a very debatable book if either one of them come out.